A fragile ceasefire, a high-stakes leaders summit, and major court proceedings. As always, a busy week in American politics. To break it all down for us, we're joined by our Washington bureau chief, Jackson Proskow. Jackson, let's start with the U.S. and Iran once again exchanging strikes, violating a fragile ceasefire reached last month. What prompted the latest escalation, and what could happen next?
Well, it all came down to the fact that Iran continued to attack ships that were passing through the Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. and many of its NATO allies actually said, you know what, this is a violation of that memorandum of understanding, what had broadly been considered a ceasefire. And so the U.S. for 2 days in a row launched strikes on nearly 200 targets, largely Iranian military targets along the Strait of Hormuz, as well as a key rail link that links Iran to both Russia and China. And all of this resulted in Iran then responding with its own retaliatory attacks against U.S. military bases throughout the Middle East. That said, it feels like things are now in a very tense place where it's not clear if the ceasefire stands, if the two sides can come back to the table, or if talks have completely broken off. At the NATO summit, Trump himself, the president, said that he thought that the ceasefire was over, done, dead, and he called the Iranians scum. But then he sort of seemed to suggest that there wouldn't be a return to all-out war. Israel, which of course is the U.S. partner in these attacks on Iran, says it's fully ready to return to war if needed. But again, at this point, it's not clear that we're actually headed in that direction. Things just seem to be in this very tense and uncertain place right now.
Now, speaking of that NATO summit, it was a busy one for President Trump. While there, Trump also doubled down on his push to acquire Greenland, threatened to cut off trade with Spain, and announced he'll allow Ukraine to manufacture Patriot missiles. What else stood out to you during that two-day meeting, Jackson?
You know, for all the bluster we've heard from Trump about NATO and about his disappointment that NATO did not step up and join the U.S. in its war against Iran and helping ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz, it actually seemed to be a pretty friendly summit, all things considered, at the end of the day. I think a lot of NATO leaders and outside observers were bracing for Trump to do something wild and completely off the rails. And yes, there were those comments about cutting off trade with Spain, but for the most part, he actually said that NATO allies were on his side, and most countries, including Canada, of course, have invested billions of dollars trying to meet their increased defense spending commitments, something that Trump has pushed for years now. Most countries are at around 4% of GDP on their way to a 5% target, so this is something that Trump and NATO Secretary General are very, very happy about. And generally speaking, NATO allies, again, including Canada and France, said that the U.S. was right to resume attacks against Iran, saying that Iran had violated the ceasefire. Canada has actually gone so far as to say that once there is a permanent ceasefire in place, it's ready to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. So, broadly speaking, Trump seemed to walk away from this feeling like he'd won and gained.
Now, closer to home this week, Republican lawmaker Claudia Tenney introduced a legislation aimed at punishing Canadian provinces for restricting the imports of American alcohol. What's she actually proposing, and what kind of support does she have right now?
Yeah, she's proposing a piece of legislation called the Canada Act, and that stands for Combating Attacks on Our National Alcoholic Drinks by Allies. And essentially what she's saying is that it's unfair that many American wineries and distilleries have been shut out of the Canadian market because of the ongoing boycotts taking place. Now, we should say this lawmaker makes no mention of the circumstances here, which were, of course, Trump's comments about annexing Canada as the 51st state and those tariffs on Canada. That said, the suggestion is that the U.S. Trade Representative undertakes some sort of investigation into alleged unfair trade practices and then determine if there should be retaliatory measures, tariffs, or something else on Canada.
Meantime, Democrat Graham Plattner suspended his Senate run amid sexual assault allegations. What do we know about the allegations, and how big of a blow is this to Democrats' efforts to regain power in Washington?
Yeah, the most recent allegation that really sort of ended his campaign was from a woman who said that she had dated Plattner, that he sexually assaulted her during that time, that there was non-consensual sex. And that really seemed to be the final nail in the coffin here for Plattner's campaign. Already there had been questions about an alleged Nazi tattoo on his chest at the start of the campaign. Other women seemed to come forward and make allegations as well. And really, this became too much to bear. And so Plattner announced midweek that he was suspending his campaign. Monday, this coming Monday, is the deadline for him to withdraw, and he says he will formally withdraw by then. And then we're just a couple weeks away from Maine Democrats actually having to select their candidate. If they don't do that, there will not be a name on the ballot. And Maine has been critical to Democrats' plans to take back control of the Senate. So really, time is not on their side. The rush is on to try and find someone new. And then after that will come the postmortem as to how a candidate who had some pretty visible flaws like Plattner ended up becoming the nominee.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. Let's end on this. Jackson, on Wednesday, a federal judge ruled that writer Jean Carroll can collect more than $5 million held in escrow since a jury in 2023 found that President Trump sexually abused and defamed her. What's the reaction and aftermath been on the decision so far?
Not just the $5 million, but also another $800,000 in interest for her. This was all being debated, of course, by the courts, and the Trump administration had actually pressured the Supreme Court to get involved and perhaps overturn the case and the jury settlement. That was rejected by the Supreme Court, though, and now Trump essentially has to pay. This is a major victory for her. This, of course, was a civil case, but it really shows that, yes, despite the number of times that the Supreme Court has said things like President Trump has immunity for official acts, there are still some corners of the law that he cannot escape. And so, yes, the jury had found him liable for sexually abusing Carroll in a department store dressing room in the early 90s, and that decision was ultimately upheld.
Again, it was a busy week, but you've been covering it all for us. We appreciate it. Our Washington Bureau Chief, Jackson Proskow. Thank you.